The snow wasn't just falling, it was trying to bury the world. It pressed down on the pines until they bent like old men praying, the wind screaming through them like a ghost. And in the middle of all that white rage was a cabin, hunkered down, practically invisible. Inside, a woman named Margaret Holloway sat by a stove that fought a losing battle with the cold. The firelight made the shadows on the walls dance, and sometimes she felt like they were the only company she had. She was barely 30, but her hair already had threads of silver, and her eyes had that deep, hollow look of someone who's spent too much time with silence. For 7 years she'd lived out here, on the edge of everything, where the town of Boone Hollow and its whispers couldn't quite reach her. They called her an oddity down there, a woman alone. A woman left behind not once but twice. The gossip had sharp teeth, so she decided to stop feeding it. She chopped her own wood, grew her own food, and only went to town when she absolutely had to. She was used to being alone. She thought she preferred it. She stood up, the floorboards groaning, and pressed her palm against the heavy wood of the door. The whole cabin shuddered with the force of the gale. A part of her wanted to add another bolt, to lock the world out for good. But another part, a small, aching part she never admitted to, hesitated. And that's when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a horse, exhausted, forcing its way through the deep snow. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one came out this far. Not in a storm like this. Not unless they were running from something worse than the weather. She peered through a crack in the shutters and saw a shape materialize from the swirling white. It was a giant. A man bigger than any she'd ever seen, mounted on a horse that was about to collapse. And behind him, tied to a second horse, were two small shapes, slumped over like forgotten dolls. The sight was a punch to the gut. He slid off his horse, his boots sinking deep, and his eyes found her window. They were pale gray, like ice on a winter river, and they held 1,000 stories she didn't want to know. He stumbled toward her door, and when his fist hit the wood, it sounded less like a knock and more like a promise of trouble. "Ma'am." His voice was gravel and exhaustion. "My boys, they need shelter." She didn't think, she just acted. The fear could wait. She threw the door open, and he had to duck to get inside, his frame filling the entire doorway. Snow cascaded off his bearskin cloak, melting into puddles on her floor. He gently lifted the two small boys from the other horse and laid them on the worn rug by the fire. They were twins, maybe 6 years old, their faces raw and red from the cold. Maggie dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as she brushed the ice from their eyelashes. She pressed her ear to their tiny chests, one after the other, and the faint, fragile thump-thump of their heartbeats was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "They're alive," she whispered, a wave of relief so sharp it almost brought her to her knees. The giant just nodded, sinking onto a small stool that groaned under his weight. His hands were a road map of scars, the veins standing out like thick ropes. He didn't speak, but his silence was louder than the storm. Maggie flew into motion, stripping off the boys' wet clothes and wrapping them in the warmest wool blankets she owned. As she did, one of them stirred. His lips parted, and a single, impossibly soft word escaped. "Mom." The word hit her like a physical blow. It echoed in the tiny cabin, a sound of such desperate longing it stole the air from her lungs. Her hands froze. She looked up at the giant, and for a split second, she saw something in his icy eyes. It wasn't sorrow. It was pure, raw panic. Then it was gone, hidden behind a wall of stone. But she had seen it, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was no ordinary rescue. This was something else entirely. For the rest of the night, an unspoken tension filled the small cabin. Maggie made broth, her movements stiff and automatic. The giant, who eventually gave his name as Jedediah Boone, or Jed, watched her every move. He never took his eyes off the boys, Wyatt and Cole. He sat like a mountain, immovable and silent, a guardian at the gates of some terrible secret. She fed the boys spoonful by spoonful, watching the life slowly return to their faces. Wyatt, the older by a few minutes, she guessed, had sharp, watchful eyes that never seemed to leave her. Cole was softer, quieter, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were the color of a clear summer sky. Jed spoke only to name them, and when she offered her own name, Maggie, it felt strange on her tongue, like a word from a language she'd forgotten. The storm raged on, but the noise outside was nothing compared to the roaring questions inside her head. Why did that word, Mom, terrify this giant of a man? Who were they running from? The town whispers seemed so petty now. She'll die alone, not fit for a family. And yet here she was, with a family literally dropped on her doorstep. A broken, terrified family, but a family nonetheless. Late into the night, after the boys were breathing evenly in a deep sleep, she finally worked up the courage to ask. "What are you running from, Jed?" He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his pale eyes. For a long time, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice was barely a whisper. "The past has a way of chasing a man. Sometimes mountains ain't high enough to keep it from finding you." It wasn't an answer, not really. It was a warning. She didn't press. Later, she dozed in her chair and was woken by a low murmur. It was Jed, talking in his sleep, or maybe to the ghosts in the fire. His voice was raw with a pain that made her ache. "I'll keep him safe," he muttered, the words ragged. "Even if it breaks me. Him, not them. Him." Her blood ran cold. He wasn't talking about both boys, he was talking about one. And in that moment, she realized the danger they were in was far greater than a simple winter storm. One of these children was more important than the other, and someone, somewhere, was hunting them for it. The storm trapped them for days. The snow piled up against the windows, sealing them off from the world, creating a tiny, fragile universe inside the cabin walls. Slowly, a strange rhythm took hold. Jed, a man of few words, spoke with actions. He repaired her sagging roof, chopped a mountain of firewood, and moved with a quiet efficiency that made her feel, for the first time in years, safe. The boys, Wyatt and Cole, began to thaw, both literally and figuratively. Cole was the first to warm to her, his small hand finding hers as she stirred the pot over the fire. He'd offer her shy smiles that cracked the icy loneliness around her heart. Wyatt was different. He was a little sentinel, just like his father. He watched her constantly, his gaze sharp and calculating, as if trying to solve a puzzle. He rarely smiled, and when he spoke, it was in short, clipped sentences. He was a child who had learned too early that the world was not a safe place. One afternoon, while Jed was outside checking on the horses, Maggie sat with the boys by the fire, teaching them a simple string game. Cole was delighted, his giggles filling the cabin. Wyatt watched, his expression unreadable. "Our mother taught us that," he said suddenly, his small voice flat. Maggie's hands stilled. "She did?" Cole nodded eagerly. "She was pretty, like you." But Wyatt shook his head. "No, she wasn't. Our mother is dead." The words hung in the air, cold and final. Cole's face crumpled, and he started to cry softly. Wyatt didn't even look at him. He just stared at Maggie, his eyes narrowed. "Jed said a storm took her." The way he said storm made it sound like a code word for something else. Something violent. Something terrible. And when Jed came back inside, his face was a thundercloud. He saw Cole's tears and Wyatt's defiant stare, and he knew. He didn't say a word, but the temperature in the cabin dropped by 20 degrees. He pulled Wyatt aside, his voice a low, dangerous rumble she couldn't quite make out. But she saw the look on Wyatt's face. It wasn't the look of a child being scolded. It was the look of a soldier being reminded of the rules of engagement. They weren't just a family. They were a unit on the run, with secrets so deep they couldn't even trust each other. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Jed spent the rest of the day sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone setting Maggie's teeth on edge. It was a sound that spoke of readiness, of a man preparing for a fight. She tried to busy herself, kneading bread with more force than necessary, but the questions kept coming. Why the lie about their mother? Why did Wyatt seem to know it was a lie, while Cole seemed to believe it? And always, Jed's sleeping words echoed in her mind. I'll keep him safe. She found herself watching the boys, looking for a difference, a clue. They were twins, nearly identical, but now she saw it. Wyatt moved with a coiled tension, always aware of his surroundings, his eyes darting to the door, the window. Cole was softer, more open, a child still capable of trust. Jed's protection, she realized, was a suffocating blanket for both of them, but it was Wyatt who wore it like armor. The next day, the snow finally stopped. The world outside was brilliant, white, and silent. A false peace. Jed announced they would be leaving in the morning. The words felt like a stone dropping in Maggie's stomach. She had gotten used to the noise, the life that filled the corners of her empty cabin. The thought of returning to the crushing silence was unbearable. That afternoon, while Jed was packing their meager supplies, she saw him talking to Wyatt outside. His back was to her, but she could see the intensity in his posture. He gripped Wyatt's shoulders, his huge frame bent over the small boy. She couldn't hear the words, but the message was clear. It was a briefing, a final set of instructions before moving out. Cole was inside with her, drawing pictures in the frost on the window pane. He looked up at her, his blue eyes wide. "Are we leaving?" he asked, his voice trembling. She knelt down beside him. "It seems so." He looked out the window at his father and brother. "I don't want to go," he whispered. "I like it here." He paused, then looked at her, his expression so full of hope it broke her heart. "Will you come with us?" The question was so innocent, so impossible. Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the still air. Not one horse, but several. Moving fast. Jed spun around, his hand instantly going to the long knife at his belt. Wyatt straightened up, his small body rigid. They were here. Whoever they were running from had found them. Jed shoved Wyatt behind him and barked an order at the cabin. "Inside! Bolt the door!" Maggie didn't hesitate. She slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the thick wooden bar into place, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Cole was crying, his small hands clutching her skirt. She peered through the crack in the shutters. 3 riders were cresting the hill, their dark figures stark against the endless white. They weren't moving like lost travelers. They were moving like hunters. And as they got closer, her blood ran cold. She recognized the man in the lead. It was Amos Crowley, the self-appointed leader of Boone Hollow, a man whose cruelty was as legendary as his family's wealth. With him were Caleb Price and another man she didn't know, both with rifles held loosely in their hands. This wasn't a rescue party. It was a posse. Jed was inside now, his face grim. He pushed Maggie and the boys toward the back of the cabin, away from the door. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl. The riders stopped just outside. "Jedediah Boone!" Amos Crowley's voice was slick with false friendliness. "We know you're in there. Word reached town about the woman on the mountain taking in a stray. A very large stray." He chuckled, a nasty grating sound. "Come on out, Jed. We just want to talk." Jed stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the door. He was a predator, coiled and ready to strike. "He's lying," Wyatt whispered from behind Maggie. his voice shaking but firm. "He always lies. He always lies." The boy had met this man before. This wasn't a random encounter. This was personal. "Last chance, Boone!" Crowley shouted, the friendliness gone from his voice. "We can do this easy, or we can do this the way your father would have." The mention of his father made Jed flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. The name Boone, the town of Boone Hollow. The pieces started to click into place with horrifying speed. Jed wasn't just from here. His family was this place, and it was a legacy soaked in blood. A shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door right next to the shutter. Cole screamed. Maggie pulled him tighter, shielding his body with her own. This was it. The past Jed had been running from hadn't just caught up. It had come to burn his world down. "That was a warning," Crowley yelled. "Next one comes through the door." Jed moved then, not towards the door, but towards the hearth. He grabbed the heavy iron poker, its weight seeming insignificant in his massive hand. He looked at Maggie, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, bleak certainty. "When I go out," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "you take the boys out the back window. Run for the trees. Don't stop." It wasn't a request. It was an order. He was planning to sacrifice himself to buy them time. "No!" Maggie heard the word come from her own mouth, fierce and unfamiliar. "We are not running." Jed stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. This was not the timid, broken woman he'd met in the storm. This was someone else. "They don't want you," she said, her mind racing, connecting the dots. "They want the boys, or one of them. That's it, isn't it?" The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. "It's about your family, about the Boone name." His silence was all the confirmation she needed. Amos Crowley was the grandson of a man Jed's father, Elias Boone, had reputedly ruined, stealing his land to build the town that bore their name. This wasn't just about an old feud. This was about inheritance, about power. "The old Boone charter," she whispered, remembering the local legend. "It says the town's land and assets belong to the Boone line as long as a male heir exists to claim it." Jed's face was a mask of stone. "They think if they get rid of the boys," she continued, her voice trembling with the horror of it, "Boone Hollow belongs to them, to Crowley." Another shot ripped through the cabin, this one shattering the small window above the sink. "Time's up, Boone!" The men outside were getting impatient. Jed took a step toward the door, ready to face them, ready to die. But Maggie stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "No," she said again, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You fight them out there. You prove you're the monster they think you are. You prove you're your father's son." His eyes flashed with anger. "What else can I do?" "You can let me talk to them," she said. He looked at her as if she were crazy. "They'll kill you." "They won't," she said, her gaze steady. "They won't shoot an unarmed woman. They're cruel, but they're cowards. Their power comes from whispers and fear. I've lived in the shadow of their judgment for years. I know how they think." Before he could argue, she walked to the door, her heart a frantic drum. She took a deep breath, lifted the heavy bar, and opened the door. The sudden sunlight was blinding. Amos Crowley sat on his horse, a cruel smirk on his face that faltered when he saw her. He had been expecting the giant, not the town recluse. Caleb Price lowered his rifle slightly, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Maggie Holloway," Amos sneered, recovering quickly. "Playing house with a murderer's get. I'd heard the rumors, but I didn't think you'd sunk this low." "There are no murderers here, Amos," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying in the cold air. "Just a father protecting his children." "Those aren't his children," Amos spat. "They're a curse, the last of a poisoned bloodline. That man's father, Elias Boone, built this town on stolen land and broken bones." We're just here to correct a historical wrong." "By killing 2 little boys?" she shot back, her voice ringing with contempt. "Is that how you correct a wrong, Amos? By becoming the very thing you claim to hate?" A murmur went through the other men. She had struck a nerve. Caleb wouldn't meet her eyes. "This ain't your business, Maggie," Amos warned, his voice turning ugly. "Get back inside before you get hurt." "This is my home," she said, taking a step forward. "And everyone in it is under my protection. You want him, you have to come through me." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble, but her stance was unyielding. She saw a flicker of doubt in Amos's eyes. He had built his power on intimidation, on the town's fear of him. A public, bloody confrontation with an unarmed woman wasn't part of his plan. From behind her, Jed appeared in the doorway. He didn't have the poker. His hands were empty, open at his sides. He stood there, a silent mountain, his presence a powerful statement. He wasn't hiding. He was standing with her. The standoff stretched, the silence broken only by the nervous shuffle of the horses. Amos looked from Maggie's defiant face to Jed's stony resolve, and he saw his victory slipping away. He had expected a cornered animal, not a fortress with a new, unexpected guardian. Then, something shifted. Wyatt and Cole appeared in the doorway behind Jed, peeking around his massive legs. 2 small, pale faces. Not monsters, not a curse, just children. The third man, the one Maggie didn't know, lowered his rifle completely. "Amos," he said, his voice low. "They're just kids." That was it. The spell was broken. Amos Crowley's power was built on a story, a narrative of the monstrous boons. But the reality in front of them, 2 terrified children and a woman a foot shorter than him standing her ground, didn't fit the story. Amos glared at them, his face contorted with fury. He had been so close. "This isn't over, Boone," he snarled. "This land will be ours." He yanked on his horse's reins, turning it so sharply it whinnied in protest. He galloped away, Caleb and the other man following reluctantly in his wake. As their figures disappeared over the rise, Maggie finally let out the breath she'd been holding. Her knees felt weak, but she didn't fall. Jed stepped out and stood beside her, his huge shoulder almost touching hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. In the shared silence, a new truth settled. This wasn't his fight anymore. It was theirs. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The immediate threat was gone, but a new, more complex reality took its place. They were no longer just survivors of a storm. They were a fortress, besieged. Jed didn't talk about leaving anymore. He worked relentlessly, reinforcing the cabin, setting snares, stockpiling wood, his every action screaming that he was digging in for a long fight. He was preparing for war. But it was Maggie who had truly changed. The woman who had hidden from whispers was gone. In her place was someone who had faced down armed men and won. She moved with a new purpose, a new confidence that was reflected in the way she cared for the boys. She was no longer just a caretaker. She was a protector. A strange, unspoken domesticity began to settle over them. Maggie taught the boys their letters, her voice soft and patient. Jed taught them how to track animals in the snow, his instructions gruff but gentle. They ate meals together, the 4 of them crowded around the small table. It almost felt normal. It almost felt like a family. But the secret still lingered, a poison in the air. One evening, as the boys slept, Maggie finally confronted Jed. "You have to tell me everything," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I stood up to Amos for you, for the boys. I have a right to know exactly what I'm fighting for." Jed looked into the fire, his face a landscape of old pains. For a long time he was silent. Then he began to speak. His voice was low, heavy with the weight of memory. He told her about his father, Elias Boone, a man who was as cruel as he was powerful, a tyrant who ruled Boone Hollow with an iron fist. Jed had run away from that legacy as a young man, wanting no part of his father's empire of fear. He had met a woman, Lena, and for a few years he had been happy. They had the twins, and he thought he had escaped his past. But Elias Boone's shadow was long. When the old man died, the vultures started circling. Men like Amos Crowley, who believed the Boone fortune was rightfully theirs. They came for him, not with lawyers, but with guns. Lena, she was caught in the crossfire, Jed said, his voice breaking for the first time. It wasn't a storm that took her. It was a bullet meant for me. The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. This wasn't about land. It was about revenge. And the boys? Maggie asked softly. Why did you say you'd keep him safe? Why is one of them more important? Jed finally looked at her, his eyes filled with an agony so profound it made her want to look away. Because they're not both mine, he said, the words tearing out of him. Lena, before me. She was with another man. He was a good man, but he was poor, and my father drove him away. She never told me which one was his. She loved them both the same, and she made me promise I would too. The secret was finally out, a bombshell that changed everything. Wyatt or Cole was the true, final heir of Elias Boone. The other was the son of a nameless man. And Jed had no idea which was which. Crowley knows, Jed continued, his voice barely a whisper. His family has the old records. They know there's a chance one of the boys isn't a Boone. But they don't know which one, so they have to eliminate both of them to be sure. Maggie stared at him, her mind reeling. This was a secret of impossible weight. He was protecting both boys, but one of them was the key to a fortune and a legacy of hate, and the other was just a boy he had promised to love. And he had carried that burden all alone. Until now. The revelation settled between them, heavy and unbreakable. Maggie now understood the constant tension in Jed, the way he watched Wyatt, the fiercely protective soldier, and Cole, the soft-hearted dreamer. He wasn't just guarding his sons. He was guarding a devastating secret that could tear them apart. He loved them both, but the world only cared about the bloodline of one. Her heart ached for him, for the sheer loneliness of his burden. She reached out and placed her hand on his, a simple gesture that felt monumental. You are not alone in this anymore, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He looked down at her hand on his, and his big, scarred fingers gently closed around it. A silent acceptance, a shared vow. From that moment on, they were a united front. The pretense dropped away. They were partners, strategizing, planning. They knew Crowley would be back, and this time, he wouldn't be so easily deterred. He would bring more men, and he would come ready for a real fight. Jed taught Maggie how to shoot the small hunting rifle she kept above the mantel, a gun she hadn't fired in years. Her hands were steady, her eyes surprisingly true. She, in turn, showed him the old forgotten root cellar hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a perfect hiding place for the boys if the worst should happen. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy rhythm, as if they had been doing this for a lifetime. The boys sensed the shift. The fear in the cabin was replaced by a quiet determination. They saw Maggie standing shoulder to shoulder with their father, an unshakable force. For the first time, perhaps in their entire lives, they felt truly safe. One afternoon, Wyatt came to her as she was mending one of his shirts. He stood silently for a moment, watching her needle move in and out of the fabric. You're not scared of him, he said. It wasn't a question. No, she replied softly. I'm not. Even though he's a Boone? Wyatt asked, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. He's not his father, she said, looking him straight in the eye. And you are not your grandfather. A name is just a word. It's who you choose to be that matters. He considered this for a long moment, the weight of his legacy heavy on his small shoulders. Then he gave her a small, tentative smile. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. The peace was shattered a week later. The warning came from the birds, a sudden panicked silence in the forest. Jed looked at Maggie, his eyes grim. "They're coming." He herded the boys towards the hidden cellar. "No matter what you hear," he told them, his voice stern, "you do not come out." Cole was crying, but Wyatt's face was set, his small jaw tight. He looked at Maggie. "You'll be okay," he said, a statement of pure, childish faith. A faith she had to honor. As she closed the cellar door over them, she heard the sound of a dozen horses approaching. This was it, the final battle for Boone Hollow. And for their future. Maggie grabbed her rifle and took up a position by the window. Jed stood by the door, the heavy iron poker in one hand, his long knife in the other. Outside, a small army had assembled. Amos Crowley was at the front, his face a mask of smug triumph. He had at least 10 men with him, all armed. They weren't here to talk. "It's over, Boone!" Crowley shouted. "We've got you surrounded. Give us the boys and we'll let you and the woman walk away." "You know I can't do that, Amos," Jed called back, his voice calm and even. Crowley laughed. "I thought you'd say that. I guess we'll just have to burn you out." He gave a signal, and 2 of his men dismounted with torches. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. They were going to burn the cabin down with them inside. This wasn't a fight they could win with force. She looked at Jed, his face grim, ready to sell his life as dearly as possible. But she remembered her own words. "You fight them out there. You prove you're the monster they think you are." There had to be another way. An idea sparked in her mind, a wild, desperate gamble. "Jed," she whispered urgently. "The town charter. You said Crowley has the records. Where are they?" "The town hall," he said, his eyes still fixed on the men outside. "Locked in the founder's safe." "The safe Elias Boone built?" she pressed. He nodded. "It has a false back. My father showed me once. A secret compartment where he kept his private ledgers." A plan, insane and improbable, formed in her mind. "I'm going to the town," she said. Jed turned to her, his face a storm of disbelief. "Are you crazy? They'll kill you before you get halfway down the mountain." "No, they won't," she said, her voice firm. "They're all here. The town is empty. You just have to buy me time." Before he could argue, she was moving. She slipped out the back window, using the deep snowdrifts as cover. Jed watched her go, a look of terror and awe in his eyes. Then he turned back to the door, his resolve hardening. He had to give her time. As Maggie ran, stumbling through the deep snow, she heard the first shots ring out from the cabin. Jed was holding them off. He was fighting for her. For them. She ran faster, her lungs burning, the fate of their strange little family resting squarely on her shoulders. She was no longer Margaret Holloway, the town outcast. She was a warrior, running towards the fire, not away from it. The journey to Boone Hollow was a nightmare of burning lungs and screaming muscles. Every gunshot she heard echoing from the mountain was a spur, driving her forward. She didn't let herself think about what was happening back at the cabin. She just focused on the goal. The town hall was dark and silent, just as she'd hoped. The whole town was up on the mountain, thirsty for blood. She found a window at the back and smashed it with a rock, the sound of shattering glass deafening in the silence. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of old paper and secrets. She found the founder's safe in the main office, a huge, imposing iron box with the name Elias Boone emblazoned on it in faded gold leaf. She had no hope of opening it, but she didn't need to. She ran her hands along the back, just as Jed had described, searching for a seam, a catch, anything. Her fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation. She pressed. A low click echoed in the room, and a section of the back panel swung inward, revealing a dusty, hidden compartment. Inside was a single, leather-bound ledger. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Elias Boone's spidery handwriting filled the pages. It was a record of his dealings, his loans, his acquisitions. And then she found it. A page detailing the purchase of the land where Amos Crowley's family farm had once stood. It wasn't a theft. It was a sale, properly documented, with a bill of sale signed by Amos's great-grandfather. Elias had been a hard man, but he wasn't a thief. The entire Crowley feud was built on a lie, a story of victimhood passed down through generations to justify their greed. But that wasn't the biggest secret. Tucked into the back of the ledger was another document. A baptismal certificate. For a boy named Wyatt. The mother's name was Lena, but the father's name wasn't Jedediah Boone. It was Samuel, Lena's first love, the man Elias had driven away. It had been Wyatt all along. He was the one with no claim to the Boone name. And Cole was the true heir. Jed had been protecting the wrong boy. Or rather, he had been protecting the boy who needed it most, without even knowing it. This changed everything. She grabbed the ledger and ran. She had to get back. She had to stop the fighting. She had the truth. And the truth was a weapon more powerful than any gun. By the time she scrambled back up the mountain, the clearing around the cabin was a war zone. 2 of Crowley's men were down, and Jed was bleeding from a gash on his arm, but he was still on his feet, a cornered bear fighting with primal fury. The cabin itself was on fire, flames licking up one side of the dry timber. Crowley was screaming orders, his face twisted in a mask of rage. "Hold your fire!" Maggie's voice shrieked across the clearing. Everyone froze, turning to see her standing at the edge of the woods, panting, holding the old ledger up like a shield. "It's over, Amos," she yelled. "Your family's claim, your righteous anger, it's all based on a lie." She strode into the middle of the clearing, her fear replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "I have your father's ledger, Elias Boone's private records." A flicker of panic crossed Crowley's face. "She's lying! It's a trick!" "Am I?" she said, opening the book. "It says right here that your great-grandfather sold his land to Elias Boone. He wasn't cheated. He was paid a fair price. You have no claim. This was never about justice. It was about greed." She threw the ledger onto the snow at his feet. The men looked at him, then at the book, their loyalty wavering. The story that had united them was crumbling. "That's not all," Maggie said, her voice dropping, turning to face Jed. "There's something else, something you all need to know." She took a deep breath. "There is only one Boone heir. It's Cole." She saw the shock on Jed's face, the confusion. She pulled the baptismal certificate from her pocket. "Wyatt is not a Boone. His father was Samuel, the man Lena loved before you." Jed stared at the paper, then at Wyatt, who had somehow crept out of the cellar and was standing near the burning cabin, his small face pale with shock. In that moment, everything could have shattered. The secret was out. But then, something incredible happened. Jed looked at Wyatt, not with disappointment, but with a wave of pure, unadulterated love. He had promised to protect them both, and a name didn't change that promise. He crossed the clearing in 3 strides and knelt before the small boy, pulling him into a fierce embrace. "You are my son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You will always be my son." Crowley watched this, his face contorted with hate. His plan was in ruins. He raised his pistol, his eyes wild, and aimed it straight at Cole, who was now standing beside Maggie. "If I can't have this land," he screamed, "then no Boone ever will." He fired, but he didn't hit Cole. He hit Maggie. She had thrown herself in front of the boy without a second's thought. The shot sent a searing pain through her shoulder, and she collapsed into the snow, the world tilting sideways. the clearing erupted into chaos. But the sound that cut through it all was a roar of pure, inhuman rage. It came from Jed. He moved faster than a man his size should be able to move. He was on Crowley in a heartbeat, his hands closing around the smaller man's throat. The other men, their cause lost, their leader disgraced, simply melted away into the forest, wanting no part of the primal justice that was about to unfold. Jed lifted Crowley off the ground, the man's face turning purple, his feet kicking uselessly. And in Jed's eyes was the reflection of his father, the killer, the monster they had all feared. He was seconds away from becoming the very thing he'd spent his life running from. "Jed, don't!" It was Wyatt's voice. Small, but clear. Jed paused, his eyes still locked on Crowley. "Don't be him," the boy pleaded. "Don't be Elias." The words broke the spell. Jed looked from the boy to Maggie, lying wounded in the snow, and the rage in his eyes slowly faded, replaced by something else. He dropped Crowley, who fell to the ground, gasping and choking. Justice wasn't killing this pathetic man. Justice was living, and living better. He rushed to Maggie's side, his hands gentle as he assessed the wound. It was bad, but it would heal. The fire was spreading, but the cabin could be rebuilt. The whispers of the town would surely turn into a roar, but they would face them together. As he lifted her carefully into his arms, he looked at his two sons, Wyatt and Cole, standing side by side, no longer defined by bloodlines, but by brotherhood. They were a family, forged in fire and secrets, and they had survived. The storm was finally over. Not just the storm of snow, but the storm of the past. They had faced the ghosts of Boone Hollow, and won. And as Jed carried Maggie toward the shelter of the pines, leaving the burning wreckage of the old life behind, he knew they weren't just running from something anymore. They were walking toward a new beginning. If you believe that the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into, and you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, then don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales that prove the human spirit is the hardest thing in the world to break.